ladies and gentlemen. First, my apologies for not having been here the last couple of days. I was abroad and just got in last night. Second, my apologies for not having circulated my paper in time for it to be in your files. But I assure you, I have a paper and I will give it to Shabanti and hope she'll be able to email all of you in a few days' time. This conference on non-traditional security was originally supposed to begin with this session on economic and financial issues, which I think was the right way to have looked at it. Unfortunately, partly because of my not being able to come here the last couple of days, I think Shabanti very kindly shifted it to the last session. Though in my own thinking, I know yesterday Shivshankar Menon raised some questions about, to what extent the so-called non-traditional security issues are really security issues, and to what extent are they non-traditional. I think if there is one set of issues that have a direct bearing on both security and strategy, it is economic, financial and fiscal challenges or threats. For reasons mentioned already by the chairman, that they not only can contribute to conflict, as I shall argue, but they can also diminish the capability for defense, and therefore both on the supply side and on the demand side, economic and fiscal factors can have serious implications and have had historically serious implications for national security, for defense, and therefore are certainly not non-traditional by any sense of that term. They are very traditional factors impacting on both security and strategy. The Government of India produced a strategic defense review, the first of its kind in 2000. In fact, our chairman was also associated with that. And in that strategic defense review, national security has been defined in this manner. There are several dimensions to national security, and I'm quoting, "Clearly, national security encompasses more than national defense and internal security, and its foundations must rest on the social and economic well-being of the people. A socially fractious, economically backward, and politically divided nation is unlikely to be militarily secure. Military security is a necessary, not a sufficient condition for national security. Equally, human and economic security is also a necessary and not sufficient condition of national security. It is only when both are assured can national security be ensured. However, the foundation of national security for a developing country like ours will remain rapid and equitable economic progress based on the development of domestic capabilities and international competitiveness." And I think that kind of definition brings together the relationship between economic competitiveness and capability and national security and defense capability and so on and so forth. So I think I don't have to belabor the point, but there is every good reason why a conference on Asian security should focus on economic trends and their impact on national security and geopolitics. To be sure, the pursuit of economic interests, which is both needs and wants, and I don't want to take too much time into getting into definitional issues, but for those of you who are students of economics, we know the difference between needs and wants. This has been a traditional cause of conflict, along with ideology. Basically, if you go back in history, most conflict is either driven by ideology, which can be religion, for example, which continues to be an enduring ideology for conflict, or interests, most interests, whether it's the territorial aggrandizement or pursuit of markets, pursuit of strategic assets, and so on and so forth, are all underlying economic factors. So economic factors have been a traditional source of security threats and conflict between nations. Economists actually try to legitimize this in a kind of a theoretical sense through the dogma or ideology of mercantilism, which endures indeed even today when many countries pursue mercantilist policies, where it's been defined as the trade follows the flag. In other words, you need to put the flag ahead, push national interests, push national power as a vehicle for economic betterment, as a vehicle for trade, as a vehicle for pursuit of markets, and so on and so forth. So the idea that trade follows the flag, which is what defines mercantilism, has been an enduring factor shaping defense strategies and conflict and over centuries. And even today, there are states in the world which have been which are regarded to continue to pursue mercantilist economic policies. On the issue of cause and consequence, if you look at, probably have heard of this book by Liaquat Ahmed on the Lords of Finance, which is an analysis of the depression and the management of the fisc and the banking system in the interwar period in the 1930s. A very powerful argument there to show how the Second World War, in a sense, was an inevitable outcome of the management of the consequences of the First World War, the economic management, the economic and financial management of the consequences of the First World War. That, in a sense, the kind of pressures that Europe exerted on Germany elicited the kind of reactions that you did get, and the intimate relationship between economic crisis and political crisis, resulting in conflict and military response, is something which is there for us to see just from the experience of the last century. Traditionally, the aggrandizement of land, resources, labor, and markets have defined conflict. However, the revisionist view, and it's not an entirely unreasonable view, and I myself, to a large extent, subscribe to this, and which Kanti Bajpai has unfortunately called the neoliberal view, though one can debate whether that's a neoliberal view or a liberal view, suggests that trade and economic integration can create interdependencies that reduce conflict. So, if mercantilism argues that the pursuit of trade and economic interests is a cause for conflict because it creates tension between states, the opposite view which has been popular in more recent times, is that actually trade and economic interdependence reduces conflict because it creates interdependencies, and that has been the logic of regional economic integration in many parts of the world. And you can make an argument on both sides, and when we come down to the basics, frankly, it's very difficult to decide whether economics scores over political factors. You can have a perfectly rational economic argument for why there should not be conflict, and yet political or ideological factors that drive conflict, and therefore the economists need not always have the last word. Apart from economic factors, financial factors including the search for bullion and the management of currency regimes have also contributed to conflict between nations. As long as there was a gold standard, the search for bullion was an important motive force of conflict. But in the more recent post-war period, with the International Monetary Fund managing the global financial system, that has not been a source of conflict. And yet, one of the consequences of the current financial crisis, the transatlantic financial crisis and the European debt crisis, and on the other hand, the rise of China, could be a new contestation on the kind of currency regime and financial regime that we expect to have. And we have a paper later in this session looking at China's approach to this issue. It's not necessary that there should be actually armed conflict or military conflict or conflict between nations. But there certainly is what I would call geo-economic conflict, if you like, a contest for power in the international system as a consequence of the weakening of the euro, the weakening of the dollar, the strengthening of the renminbi. And it's all there in front of us to see how even though we no longer live in the world of the gold standard and the pursuit of the bullion, but the pursuit of strong currency, and therefore through that the pursuit of purchasing power has geo-economic consequences, does contribute to creation of alliances alliance systems. I mean, you're seeing what's happening in Asia with the Chiang Mai multilateralization of the Chiang Mai Initiative multilateralization, CMIM, and the growth of the Asian bond markets. All of this is a framework for the creation of new currency regimes. China, for example, has openly advocated the idea which Japan first floated 20 years ago of an Asian monetary fund as a kind of a rival to the International Monetary Fund in case the objective of altering the structure of power within the International Monetary Fund is not attained. So management of global currency regimes need not have contribute to actually armed conflict. I don't think that is the case in the modern world, but certainly has geopolitical consequences in terms of creating new relationships between states. There is, of course, the whole issue of domestic sources of conflict as a result of the impact of economic phenomenon on domestic politics. And I'm not going to get into that in this paper. It's a fairly easy argument to make that whenever countries have an economic crisis at home, they try to export the problem abroad. There are typically two ways in which these problems are exported. One is what you can call scapegoatism. You say somebody else is responsible for the problems at home, and therefore military adventure, etc., can be a consequence. War can be a consequence of the inability of management of the political consequences of domestic economic crisis. And there are examples I can give, and I will give in the written paper. But the second consequence is much more researched, which is the pursuit of beggar my neighbor economic policies. Beggar my neighbor policies were in fact responsible for much of the conflict in the Second World War and the run-up to the Second World War, contributing both to the economic crisis and to the political conflict and the military conflict. You will remember that one of the first things that the G8 did after the Lehman collapse was to convene the G20, and one of the first items on the agenda of the G20 was to preserve the multilateral trading system and to discourage countries from pursuing beggar my neighbor policies. It still remains on the agenda. We have not had any progress on multilateral trading regime in the last 3 years. The optimists think that after the US election it will return to the table. The pessimists think that we are moving away from multilateralism to regionalism in trade. Initiatives like the Trans-Pacific Partnership that the United States has taken have been criticized. Jagdish Bhagwati recently wrote a column in the Financial Times very strongly against that, because that is encouraging regionalism. But this entire trade diplomacy in the last 3-4 years has been to prevent beggar my neighbor policies. But if you do have such policy response to the ongoing crisis, and the crisis is not over, in many ways the crisis can get worse, then you could have once again protection of markets and conflict arising out of search for markets, whether it's markets for products or services, or indeed market for energy and other resources. I think I'm running out of time. So let me quickly go through a couple of more points, and maybe in the question answers I can elaborate a little more. If you look at the financial, since my paper is focusing more on the financial crisis and not so much on other economic phenomenon, we've had 3 major financial crises in the last 3 decades. The first was the Latin American debt crisis. The second was the Asian financial crisis. And the third has been the transatlantic financial crisis. And each of them has had strategic consequences, and consequences, if you like, for geopolitics and military strategy. The Latin American financial crisis, in my judgment, and I am willing to be questioned on this because I'm not a student of Latin American security or strategy, but when you look at the facts, it's very interesting to see how one of the consequences of the Latin American financial crisis was the rolling back of the Brazilian and Argentinian nuclear program, and Brazil and Argentina kind of giving up the nuclear option. Was there a link between the two or not? I leave it for area experts to tell me if I'm right or wrong, but I can see a link in the sense that the ability of the international system to influence strategic options increased because of the financial crisis. Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, all of them one after another, and all of them were seen as they were the tigers of the 1970s, but in the 80s they slid back. It took almost 20 years for Brazil to come back. It's only in the last 10 years that Brazil has returned to the group of emerging economies. The Asian financial crisis, a huge impact on the relationship between China and Southeast Asia. It had huge political implications. I've written on this subject. Look at the collapse of the regime in Indonesia, the change of government in Korea, the change of government in Thailand, the decline in the influence of Malaysia, and the enormous increase in the influence of China in Southeast Asia. The entire geopolitics of the Asian financial crisis was there before our eyes to see. And it altered the balance of power between Japan and China in a decisive way in the period after 1998. And more recently, the transatlantic financial crisis. The chairman alluded to fiscal pressures on Western governments, NATO governments, much less, I imagine, for the United States, much more in the case of Europe. And these fiscal pressures, as a result of the financial crisis, obviously going to have geopolitical and geo-economic consequences in shaping the approach of these countries to conflict, whether in the Middle East or in the South China Sea or in Central Asia or anywhere else in the world. This is an ongoing thing. One cannot come to definitive conclusions, but one conclusion that one can come to is that the ability of the United States to respond to the financial crisis is obviously more than the ability of Europe to respond to the financial crisis, for the simple reason that Europe is facing not just a reversible financial crisis, in the sense, I didn't make this point, but all the impact of a financial crisis is reversible. I just mentioned how Brazil went down in the 70s and 80s and has come back again. So, you can have countries which suffer the consequences of a crisis for 10, 15, 20 years, but are able to pursue then policies that enable them to strengthen themselves fiscally and therefore invest in defense and other capabilities. But and the US has that capability to bounce back from the financial crisis. But Europe's problem is that this debt and financial crisis, which may in theory be transitory, is coming in the context of a more enduring demographic crisis and inability of Europe to respond socially and politically to that demographic crisis. We have seen the consequence of this in Japan. The demographic transitions of these societies becoming aging societies and their inability to remain economically competitive reduces their geopolitical power. And I think that, in my judgment, is the demographic factors rather than purely the financial factors in Europe, which are going to reduce Europe's political weight, geopolitical weight, and its military, its capability to sustain its